Before we discuss the decision-making process that Merck went through to come to a decision, let's sort of step back for a minute and look at some ethical theories that will help us in our decision-making processes, help us get some good reasons of why we decide what we decide. So in this module, we're going to discuss 5 ethical theories. One is called universalism or deontology. You don't have to remember that word, but it's kind of good if you go to a party and you're meeting someone who's boring. You say, I do deontology, and they will leave you immediately. It's perfect. Utilitarianism, cost-benefit analysis. You all probably know what that is. Rights thinking. What basic rights do people have? Fairness. We're always talking about fairness. What does that mean? And finally, virtue or character. What is a good person? What is a good company? So we'll start first with what I call the do the right thing, a principled approach, or as I said, deontology. And think back on the Merck case for a minute. Many of you, I suspect, thought, well, they just have to develop this drug. There's so many people who are affected, right? It's sort of almost, it's an intuitive feeling. I just think we should do that. And we never want to destroy those intuitive feelings. They're very important, but we want to be able to defend them. So the do the right thing is sort of a principled approach. It's the right thing to do. We ought to do it no matter what. And so the argument is of the principled approach is that, first of all, ethics focuses on human beings, only on human beings, and that we can control our actions. I can control what I do, but I can't always control the outcomes. So notice if Merck develops the drug, they can't always control how good it will be, and they can't always control how it will be used. So a principled approach is you look at the right intentions rather than the consequences, and you do what we all think is the right thing to do. So a principled approach then has to do with my duties, what I think are the right thing to do, and it's based on a decision. How do I base my decision? Not just I feel that, right? I base it on, is this something that I would like to be a general principle? Would I like all pharmaceuticals to engage in this sort of process? And you might say yes. So could it be a general rule? Does it set a precedent for other actions or for other pharmaceuticals? Does it respect the dignity of every individual or every stakeholder or every organization? So think about that in terms of Merck. So here is some sort of summary of that. Is it something we want other individuals or companies to do? Could we imagine this becoming a general principle? Does it pass the publicity test? Will Merck be proud if they engage in this? Would they be proud if they didn't? Maybe not. Does the decision respect other people as equal human beings with dignity? The other people who have river blindness. Now, there's some challenges for this do the right thing thinking. It isn't that it's wrong, it's that we have to be careful it doesn't get carried away. So, for example, what if I say, never tell a lie? You say, yes, that's true most of the time, but what if I'm facing a terrorist? What if a murderer is at the door? What if I'm a spy? There are many times when we have to lie for some other greater good. So we think about that, isn't that we just lie all the time? We know liars, we can spot them, but sometimes we have to measure that not ever telling a lie against the kind of consequences or benefits for that. So the question then comes up, what if developing this drug for river blindness actually hurts people, and what if it bankrupts Merck? Those are 2 really negative things, at least from our perspective. So let's move to the second, the cost-benefit analysis, or it's called utilitarianism or consequentialism. That's, nice big words you can use if you like. We're all utilitarians. We all measure cost and benefits all the time. Each one of you taking this course is figuring out, should I take this course? Do I want an MBA? How does this work in my MBA? What happens in life if I have an MBA versus if I don't? You measure that all the time. We think about what we don't think about, should we get up in the morning, or we probably wouldn't ever get up. But we think about everything we do, we measure. And that's all right, we should. And governments do that too. Each one of your governments measures how much welfare they should have, what sorts of health care should they provide. And they measure it against costs, the costs are always big, against the benefits to the community. We do that all the time. All the time. It's part of the way we operate, and that, according to the utilitarians, is a moral decision. So they argue that something is morally good if it creates a balance of benefits or against harms, satisfies the most interests, minimizes the most harms for the most people involved. But there's a proviso here that the founder of utilitarian, there's a guy you can look up on the web if you want to, Jeremy Bentham, said that that's the general principle, but we must remember that the interests of each and all must count, and count equally. So suppose, and there's a wonderful play about this, about a woman who in her teenage years lived in a small village in Switzerland and was raped. And she left the village in shame, went away, but she became very, very extraordinarily rich. So she went back to this very poor village, and she said, I will give you everything. I will give you jobs, schools, roads, hospitals, everything you've ever wanted, but under one condition. You have to kill the person who raped me. And they all knew who that was. Now, from a utilitarian perspective, that looks like it's a cost and benefits, right? A village of, say, 2,000 people versus one guy. But for Bentham, he would say, no, that's always wrong. That's always wrong to violate that person's rights just for the utility of the community. So the question is, should Merck invest in this research, which could, or other research that could be beneficial, like cancer, and profitable, which is also very beneficial. So with utilitarianism, one of the problems is it's very hard always to measure costs and benefits. And you know that when you read the newspapers or look at the media. How do we measure the costs, say, of welfare versus benefits? How do we measure the costs of healthcare versus benefits? Those are all questions that we bring up all the time, and we keep working at it. So we never make perfect decisions. If we overestimate the costs, bad. If we underestimate the benefits, that's not good. And finally, as my little example showed, the majority is not always right. And we all work very hard to protect the minority. And that's sometimes very difficult. So those are the two theories that we've discussed so far. So let's work on the other three. So the rights talk is taken from a 17th century philosopher, John Locke. No, you don't have to read him unless you're really interested. But it's Locke who argues, from which we get the whole basis for human rights, that just because you're born as a human being, no matter where you're born, under what circumstances, you have very basic rights. And he calls these inalienable rights. That is, you always have them. I can put you in jail, I can torture you, I can lock you up. You still have the claims to those rights. Two of the rights are obvious, the right to life. And if I have a right to life, I have a right to survive. Otherwise, the right to life doesn't mean anything if I can't survive, right? And in order to survive, I have a right to liberty, to freedom, to pursue my interests so that I can survive. This gives me the right to work, and thus, of course, the right to be paid adequately. So this is obviously an anti-slavery option, because slaves are not given any rights at all, nor are they paid for their labor. And Locke said that's wrong. It's wrong for the very simple reason that they're human beings. Now, for Locke, this is where we get our ideas of property, which is a capitalist notion. That is, we have rights to unowned property that I improve, and then eventually I have property rights. And that serves as the very basis of capitalism. And for those of you who've been brought up in other economic traditions, such as Marxism, it's Marx, of course, who criticizes this, particularly this last move toward private property. We'll talk about that in another course, not here. But anyway, Locke's basic rights have formed the foundations of the American Bill of Rights and of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here I put on the URL. You might want to look at those. There are 26 of them altogether, and one you'll like a lot, which is the right to a holiday. So the question, though, for our case is, what rights do those with river blindness have? What rights do they have? Do they have a right to access to health care with this dreadful disease? And what rights does Merck have as a property owner, as an owner of this company, and as the one who would have to develop this drug? Notice we're not quite sure here. It's not always clear, but that's all right. Ethics is not always clear. It's not always obvious what we should do. That's why it's interesting. So the question you ask in any of the cases we would do is, are there any human rights at stake here? And are any of them being violated? And that's always very difficult to figure out. And later on, we're going to discuss a case about child labor, where the argument is their rights as children are being violated. We'll come back to that case in the next module. Now, what about justice? You all talk about fairness all the time. We all talk about fairness. It wasn't fair. You gave somebody a better grade than me. It wasn't fair. My mother was nicer to her, my sister than me. We talk about fairness all the time. I have 4 children. They're always saying, it's not fair. So you understand what it means. Being fair is treating every person and every organization as an equal. So let me give you an example. If I have candy, if I have 4 children, I should have 4 pieces. No fair if I have 2, it won't work. Got to have 4 pieces of candy or none. But what if one of those 4 children is sick? That child has a right to medicine. And why? Because I want to bring her up to be equal with the other 3. So that's treating her fairly and also treating her as what is owed to her to make her up to the health standards of the other 3. So when we're treating people fairly, we're making judgments free from discrimination, but they may not be equal. That is, I may not be treating people equally, I'm treating them as equals. And secondly, justice involves distribution. How do we distribute opportunities, goods, services, welfare, voting, jobs, offices, and awards? And awards are particularly difficult because sometimes they're not rewarded fairly, as you know. For those of you who compete in sports, you know that sometimes the award is not given to the right person. So there are a lot of principles of distributive justice. We just want to think about them as we're doing these cases. Obviously, equal opportunity, and then need. Need is to bring people up to sort of being equal with others. Potentiality, we often reward people if I think that person really has a lot of potential. Or what's called dessert, that isn't the kind you eat, but that's what you get when you do the Olympics, for example, awards what? On those who win. Those are very special. In military, we award the bravest, the person we think is the bravest. So those are kinds of awards we have. A utility, again, if I'm very productive and one of you is not, the idea is I should get more benefits than you. And then certain things are distributed equally. Now, I don't know about your country, but in the United States, votes are distributed equally. Everyone gets, if you're 18, gets a right to vote, unless you are a convicted felon, and now we're beginning to argue they should have rights too. And homeless people we have difficulty with, but they're beginning to have voting rights as well. And all of us think we should have equal rights to environmental protections, that we shouldn't have to suffer more than anybody else. And then, of course, the lottery, luck or chance. There's a lot of chance in this world, and we know that. So that's sort of a way we distribute things sometimes. And then finally, but I have to mention this, if you're a libertarian, if you really are for minimal government, you think that none of these principles I have listed are fair to everyone. So we should abandon them all and make it just lottery, luck, or chance. The question we want to ask about Merck, on which of these principles should they appeal to make their decision? So this is the fairness. Does it treat everybody as an equal, provide equal opportunity? Does it offer, and then the question, does it offer any special advantages to some parties and not to others? Finally, virtue ethics. What does that mean? It sounds sort of, goody-goody or something, but it really isn't. It has to do with habit and character. Think about your friends. Think about your relatives. Think about the people you know, and you know that some of them have very good character. we all have, well, at least I do, a few relatives that are not so good, right? Yeah. So he said, they're not really very good people. That means they really don't have good character. They haven't developed good habits and good behavior. Companies also have this thing. Companies are, by and large, have what's called a dominant logic. That is a culture that runs through that company. And if that culture goes bad, if they start doing some bad things, and we're going to talk about a company, Volkswagen, in Module 4, that had some issues with their dominant logic, then what happens? We say, that's not a good company. That has not good character. It has developed bad habits. So that's a word we use all the time, although we don't think about it so much. So faced with a difficult dilemma, one of the things you want to ask is this what a virtuous person would do? Is this what a virtuous company would do? And that's what Merck has to ask in thinking about how they're going to approach this disease of river blindness.